So I've got a few slides, and then I always think the values in the Q&A, because you guys will have a wide variety of experience, and discussing what's been useful, what's not been useful for you. I think there's a lot of benefit to be had in that, in the sharing of that. So I have slides, and let me just put them. So this slide I call "Why should you bother listening to me at all?" My Agile journey is about 6 years in now. So when I was a senior HR business partner, I partnered the department that had aspirations of being fully agile, and I was sitting in a steerco. And they put up a slide about the top 6 blockers to becoming fully agile. And one of the 6 was the way we did HR in that company, which was quite a shocking moment, if I'm honest. I hadn't really heard of agile. And to say that everything your department does is the antithesis of agile was quite a moment. And I had a secret thought at the time that what if, instead of being called out as one of the top 6 blockers, we could become one of the top enablers. So that's where my journey began, and I have spent the last 6 years learning and implementing and testing different things. It was quite lonely 6 years ago because no one else in the company was looking at agile from an HR perspective. So a colleague and I, from that team, we regularly speak at conferences and whatnot, partly to just create a sense of community and help people understand that we've been there too, and you don't have to be alone. And the Agile HR community has really grown and grown, such that there are now a few Agile HR qualifications. And I am a certified Scrum Master, and I also started life as a project manager, like old school waterfall IT project manager. So I have been on both sides of this. So I have empathy for both. So I think that's really important, because you can get a lot of purists or really kind of zealots who maybe haven't been both sides of the coin. And I think having empathy for everyone in every stage of their journey is absolutely critical in this. So I feel like this slide is in the wrong order, but I'll come back to it. So what is Agile? Well, the Agile Manifesto is 20 years old next year. And it was a group of IT project experts who came together because the way we did projects wasn't working. So projects are notorious for running late, running over budget, not delivering benefits. So their view was there is a better way of doing this. And so they went off on a retreat and they came up with this manifesto. So we have come to value individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. So it doesn't mean that there isn't value on the items on the right. It doesn't mean you should never document anything, that you shouldn't have processes and tools, that you should never have a plan. It just means that you need to value the items on the left more. So people over process. And I appreciate it says software in the second line, but if you think about replacing software with product, then this can apply a lot more broadly. And when you hear Agile, you may hear some of these terms. So Scrum, Safe, Less, DAD, Lean Agile, DevOps, Crystal. I mean, there's an endless amount of jargon, an endless number of frameworks. Agile is the manifesto and the principles that support it. Everything else is someone's implementation of. So it's up to you what works for you and your team and your organization. You can use a mix of these. You can use none of these. They're all someone's idea of what Agile is or could be, because they found it useful, because they needed to make money off of something that's that is open source, because Agile is open source. There'll be a variety of reasons and a lot of different implementations. Every organization is unique and they will need unique things. Therefore, you know, if someone's telling you that you have to buy their whole framework and implement it to your whole company, that's probably not going to be the best for your organization. You know, at the heart of Agile is finding what works for your team and your organization. And it's quite rare that an organization would fully benefit from adopting one framework kind of from top to toe. And I can send a link to an article about that, which is quite interesting. So Agile isn't not a lot of misconceptions are that Agile means you don't have to have a plan. And you hear this from teams experimenting with it, especially in the early stages, maybe where they don't have a coach yet. And they're like, well, we're Agile, we don't have a plan, so we can't show you our plan. And that's not entirely true. So a traditional project does have a plan and quite a long plan, sometimes 9 months, sometimes 2 years. So that's what we often call waterfall. It's sequential. You plan it all from kind of day one. And it's very difficult to change the milestones. So you have this perfect plan. And then reality hits. And when you're delivering something, especially something new for the first time, something that involves knowledge work, and especially something, you know, that might be large or lengthy, you don't know what's going to happen. Actually, day one of the project is when you know the least about what will happen. So it is not the day that you should be cementing all of your requirements. So what Agile does to deal with this is it plans in shorter bursts nearer the time. So you may have heard language like sprints, which are common in Scrum and a few other frameworks. It's basically a much shorter planning cycle, typically 1 to 2 weeks, where you're defining the work and carrying out the work and testing the product that you've delivered in that sprint. And you can adjust your plan because closer to the time you can see the obstacles, you know your challenges, you can deal with change. So it doesn't mean that you don't have the same goal in 2 years' time. It just means that you've planned it much more adaptably. So you've done your short-term, you know, high confidence planning nearer to the event rather than setting everything out 2 years in advance and thinking that that will actually happen. So I do really love this diagram because it feels so much like real life. Agile is iterative and incremental. So by iterative, which is difficult to pronounce sometimes, you're doing things in small cycles and you're improving each time. And incremental, this is quite a famous diagram by Henrik Nieberg. Basically, from a waterfall perspective, which is the top line, you want to deliver something in 2 years' time. So you build it piece by piece, and in 2 years, you can test it with the client to see if that's what they want. With Agile, you deliver more regularly and incrementally in something we call MVP, which is minimum viable product. So at each point, you're delivering value and potentially earning from it. And testing with the customer each time. So in 2 years, first of all, you've made money along the way from the products that you've developed. And you have a much happier customer at the end because actually through your increments and iteration, you've discovered that actually they really wanted to feel the wind in their hair, which you wouldn't have known through traditional means. So I think almost every Agile Fundamentals course I've seen has some version of this diagram. So I spoke about Agile principles. And so this is the other half of Agile. So you have the manifesto, which sets out at a top level that we value certain things. And then these are the principles that do a deeper dive into it. And that's it. That's Agile. And everything else is kind of up to you. So early and continuous delivery, welcoming changing requirements, that feels very different from traditional project management. If you have been a project manager, you will have had like a strict change control. The closer you get to the end, the harder it is to change. And you really don't want change. So what Agile does is make it easier for you to adapt, and also you might get competitive advantage from that change, because the world can be a very different place, 9 months or 2 years from now, I think, as we've all experienced this year. Frequent delivery. So you're testing product with customers on a regular basis so that you can adapt it to their needs. So you should end up with happier customers, but you do need your customers on board for this. So I think managing expectations personally is always really important. Working with a customer who knows that you'll be delivering something imperfect but quickly so that you can get their feedback, you really have to set that expectation. Otherwise, they might be uncomfortably surprised if they're expecting what they used to expect, which is we will give you our requirements and 3 to 9 months later, you will deliver us something perfect. So it is a real mindset shift with the customer. Another element at the core of Agile is the collaboration daily, ideally. So in a software team, you would meet with the product owner. The team might meet with what we call a product owner on a regular basis. So a representative of the customer, who's helping them prioritize and giving regular feedback. From a cultural perspective, you very much want people to be empowered. So you would set the goal with them, but you would then leave them to figure out how to get there. And this is one of the biggest cultural shifts for me, and it probably takes the most work. Someone who's never been empowered before, being empowered for the first time, may not want to be empowered. With empowerment comes risk and responsibility. So that transition, I think, is one where we as HR can really help. Helping people have incrementally more empowerment so that it feels safe and that they get to test before they have to take full responsibility. Agile also places a lot on face-to-face as being the best method of conveying information. Now, we have to remember this is from 2001. So whether we all agree with that now and whether it's always practical, I think is a very useful thing to discuss. Certainly what the last 9 months have meant for me is actually, yes, I really prefer face-to-face, but that's me. So I think, testing this and discussing it is quite useful. One of my favorite statements about Agile can be, paperwork is not product. So you measure progress by what is actually delivered as opposed to how many status reports have been filed about it or what documentation about the requirements has been made. And as a former project manager, I genuinely felt most of the time that my job was to fill in status reports as opposed to doing actual work to on the project to make actual progress. So I feel like we report about progress sometimes more than we actually make progress. And that can be quite frustrating. So this is very freeing in that respect. And it's not that you don't update, it's that you would have different ways to update and it wouldn't be as paperwork heavy. Agile should be sustainable. So while you're delivering things more often, that doesn't mean that you're working harder. It means that you're working differently. And one of my favorite quotes, and some of you who know me on this call will have heard me say this: the art of maximizing the amount of work not done. So if you think about that and reflect on it, I think it's hugely empowering, and it really does help with the sustainability. And what I've found in Agile is you can be ruthless in your prioritization, and that is, again, very empowering and very freeing. Agile does focus on self-organizing teams. Now, of course, self-organizing teams come from a number of different areas, not necessarily associated with Agile. If we have any organizational development gurus in the team, you will have been advocating this for some time in different frameworks. And then if you take one thing away and one thing only as a behavior, at regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective and then tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly. So you will often hear this referred to as a retro, which stands for retrospective, and it's the team getting together. You know, ideally, if you're running a sprint context once every sprint, so that can be quite often, once a week or once every 2 weeks. So as a Scrum Master, that would be, if we were running 1 week sprints, we would spend 1 hour per week reflecting on how we were operating as a team. If we were running 2 week sprints, it would be 2 hours. So a chunk of 2 hours at the end. And this is a really critical behavior. So you get together, you reflect on how to become more effective, and you take just 1 or 2 actions, because too many actions means nothing will happen. And then you reflect on those actions in the next retrospective after the next delivery increment. So what I recommend based on this and on my experience with a few organizations is to be principle based, to not tie ourselves to a framework too early, and also to and this is a mistake we often make, I think, collectively as organizations, is that we think Agile is only for the software development team, and therefore it's nothing to do with us. But actually, if you look back at the principles, you know, people over process, those are useful to everyone. Regularly reflecting on how we perform as a team, that's a behavior useful to everyone. So don't just restrict it to teams who are specifically supposed to be agile. You can actually get benefit for the organization by reflecting on the principles and embedding those rather than focusing on tools. I do recommend a top-down and bottom-up approach. So Agile often starts as with a software team that wants to work better. And they will only get so far without the support of the organization. So at some point, you need finance and HR on board, because you need to budget differently, because some of your HR processes need to change. In my experience, if you set clear parameters around empowerment for the teams, that can really free you from having to over-legislate, and it gives sufficient room for experimentation. Agile is a very long journey. So some years, yeah, sorry?
Oh, sorry. Thing.
Oh, no worries. Sorry, I thought someone had a question. So you hear about organizations taking kind of 8 years, 5 to 8 years to become enterprise level Agile. So it's a huge amount of culture work. So if you start small, and then you have a few signature things that apply to the whole organization, eventually you get enough people on board that you get to a tipping point where it's the norm rather than the weirdos running experiments. And finally, and I know you will all do this anyways probably, but leverage your enthusiasts. Agile is a very difficult thing to engage people in if they are not ready. So one of the approaches that I've used successfully is go where the energy is, work where the energy is. And eventually the success they are having will mean that others want to be on board. So the business results that they have will encourage others to experiment, because you really can't force people into it. It doesn't work. You end up with them maybe using a few tools and not changing any ways of working, and you'll see very little benefit, and then they won't be bought in. So you can't force it on people, unfortunately, however much you might want to. So that is hard learned. So I thought it might be useful to kind of reflect on this. You know, we've had unusual circumstances this year, and some of those mean that we are probably testing agile working in a number of ways without really knowing it. And we may be getting benefit from that, and we may be experiencing pain from that as well. So in this year we have had rapidly changing requirements. I think we can all appreciate that. You know, a government statement comes out and you have to respond to it, sometimes on quite a wide scale. We've had both too much and too little information sometimes at the same time. And again, as knowledge workers, trying to navigate that means that, you know, having a really long range plan isn't that helpful. We've got limited precedent and or established practices. So again, this is innovation work that we're having to do. So we're having to respond to change quite quickly. We're having to innovate. It's knowledge work. We're having to work cross-functionally. So with your chief medical officer, with health and safety, with HR, with legal on a regular basis, and it's urgent. You know, the government standard might apply from that evening or from 2 days from now. And also it will feel urgent to people impacted because of you know, the consequences of some of this. So we have circumstances that mean we're probably using some agile ways of working without realizing it, is my hypothesis. Feel free to disagree. So when I reflect on the principles, this is where I see us having used these principles this year. So early and continuous delivery, that really resonates because, you know, things change weekly or every 2 weeks. And we have to be able to answer to our employees and our shareholders about what we're doing. Welcoming changing requirements. I don't know if they always felt welcome, but things were changing. So we had to be able to cope with that. You know, frequent delivery, I've already mentioned. Collaboration, I've already mentioned. Maximizing the amount of work not done. So we've had to be very satisfied with minimum viable product because that's all we have time for. And that might be all we have expertise for at the moment because so much is unknown. And then working product is the primary measure of progress. All the, you know, business continuity plans in the world are fantastic, but how we will be measured is how, you know, do people have FAQ they can deal with? Do people know whether they're supposed to come on site or not? So that kind of working product is how we're assessed at the moment, as opposed to any plans that we might have had. Where it feels less agile, is obviously we haven't been able to rely on face-to-face conversation as much as in normal times. So I think that really tests that principle. And also, when you're working in a true agile rhythm, you can maintain a constant pace indefinitely. That sustainability is absolutely core. And I don't know how many of you will feel that this year has been sustainable in terms of ways of working. So that's definitely one to reflect on. But it did feel like a unique opportunity to reflect on the agile principles and actually hypothesize that we may be doing some things effectively through these different way of working than previous, whether we intended to or not. So hopefully there are some positive learnings about how we can work together in future, but perhaps more sustainably would be my caveat. So there are a couple of Agile HR communities that I just wanted to point people to. So Agile HR community is literally the name. So if you Google it, you get their website. And they run free events and not so free events, largely in London, but also in a number of other locations. There is an agility in HR qualification offered through a number of bodies and accredited by IC Agile. And there are further levels to that now, which are new. And then Management 3.0 is an approach to how you lead an agile team. So I find it super useful from an HR perspective because it is about, okay, well, the team might be agile. How do I manage them? And what does that actually mean? How do I empower them? How do I increase what I delegate? So their 7 levels of delegation is something I use all the time for increasing empowerment of people. So that is, so that's what I had planned to say.